The story that most people think they know about Vietnam is not exactly wrong. It is something more troubling than wrong. It is carefully incomplete, and the difference between a war that was misunderstood and a war that was misrepresented is not a small distinction. It is the entire architecture of how a nation chooses to remember what it chose to do. The version that settled into public consciousness over the decades following 1975 leaned heavily on the idea that America went in with good intentions, got confused by jungle and ideology, and eventually came home chastened but essentially decent. That version required a lot of quiet editing. It required that certain documents remained classified for decades. It required that certain soldiers stay silent, not because they were ordered to, but because no one particularly wanted to hear what they had to say. And it required, most of all, that the men who came back without records, without official acknowledgment, without any paper trail connecting them to what they had done or where they had been, simply be absorbed back into civilian life, as if the gap in the documentation were a clerical error rather than a policy. There was a man, and his name is not important because his story is not unique, who returned from Southeast Asia in 1973 with a discharge classification that didn't match his service record, a service record that didn't match his deployment history, and a deployment history that, according to the Department of Defense, didn't exist. He had been in Laos. He had been in Cambodia before Cambodia was officially admitted to. He had been in places that the United States government was simultaneously denying any military presence in, while conducting sustained and intensive operations there. When he tried to access Veterans Administration benefits, the paperwork created a kind of bureaucratic loop, where each office referred him to another office, each of which referred him back to the first, because no one office could officially acknowledge the records that would have justified the claim without acknowledging the operations those records described. He spent 11 years navigating that loop. He was not unusual. He was, in many ways, representative. To understand how a soldier could come back without records, you have to understand how records were created, maintained, falsified, and selectively destroyed throughout the Vietnam War, not as an aberration, but as a standard institutional practice. The war produced paperwork at a volume that was itself a kind of performance. Body counts, sortie numbers, pacification metrics, Hamlet evaluation scores, weekly engagement reports, monthly progress summaries, each of these generated enormous quantities of documentation, and almost none of it was designed to accurately describe what was happening on the ground. It was designed to demonstrate progress toward objectives that were themselves vaguely defined, so that the documentation could always be shaped to show movement in a positive direction, regardless of what the underlying reality was. The body count is the most famous example, and it is famous precisely because it was so clearly a failure of metric design rather than a failure of honesty in any simple sense. The people designing the system were not necessarily lying. Many of them believed that if you could quantify enemy losses at a rate that exceeded enemy recruitment and resupply, you would eventually produce a mathematical condition in which the enemy could no longer function. This was called attrition strategy, and it had a certain cold logic to it on a spreadsheet. The problem was that the spreadsheet could not capture the actual conditions under which the numbers were being generated. Units in the field were under pressure to produce favorable kill ratios. Favorable kill ratios determined careers. They influenced promotions, commendations, unit citations. They affected how much resources a unit received, how much air support, how much logistical priority. So the numbers were adjusted, not always dramatically, sometimes just slightly. A patrol would engage a group of individuals who might have been combatants, and the after-action report would confirm they were combatants. A mortar attack on a village would produce a report that classified the dead as enemy forces rather than civilians, because classifying them as civilians would raise questions about the engagement and produce paperwork that nobody wanted to produce. Over time, this practice became normalized to the point where soldiers in the field stopped thinking of it as falsification. It was simply the language of official communication. You wrote the report in the language the report required, and that language bore a functional relationship to what had happened, but was not identical to it. The report was a translation, and like all translations, it lost things. What it consistently lost was ambiguity, uncertainty, civilian casualties, friendly fire incidents, unit misconduct, and any indication that the strategic situation was not improving. A soldier operating in this environment learned very quickly that his personal experience of the war and the official record of the war were two different documents. He learned this not through any dramatic revelation, but through accumulation, through the slow sediment of small discrepancies that eventually formed a layer between what he knew and what he was permitted to say he knew. And this sediment did not wash away when the war ended. It hardened. It became the material out of which his silence was built. The soldiers who came back without records were, in many cases, soldiers who had been operating in the space between those two documents. They had been doing things that the official document could not contain. They had been participants in operations that, if recorded accurately, would have contradicted the official narrative of the war in ways that were strategically, politically, or legally inconvenient. Some of them had been in Cambodia during the period before the 1970 incursion, when American forces were conducting cross-border operations that the Nixon administration was publicly denying. Some had been in Laos, where the CIA was running a parallel war using Hmong soldiers and American Special Operations personnel that was entirely separate from the official military chain of command and entirely absent from the official record. Some had been involved in the Phoenix program, a systematic effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through a combination of intelligence gathering, capture, and killing. An operation that was officially described as a pacification initiative and that produced, in its actual execution, a casualty toll that its own administrators found difficult to account for. The Phoenix program is worth dwelling on because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, how an officially sanctioned operation could become systematically undocumented through the ordinary operation of institutional incentives rather than through any coordinated conspiracy. Phoenix was run through the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, which was itself a civilian-military hybrid that sat outside the normal military command structure. The program assigned targets, Vietnamese civilians suspected of membership in or support for the Viet Cong political infrastructure, and it tasked provincial reconnaissance units with neutralizing those targets. Neutralization could mean capture. It could mean turning the individual into an informant, and it could mean killing. The program's statistics showed, over its operational life from 1968 to 1972, that it neutralized somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 individuals, depending on which count you used. What the statistics did not show was how those neutralizations were achieved, who was actually targeted, whether the intelligence underlying the targeting was reliable, or what happened to the people who were captured rather than killed. Former participants in the program, when they spoke at all, described a system in which quotas created pressure to produce results. Pressure to produce results created incentives to accept questionable intelligence. And accepting questionable intelligence meant that people were being targeted on the basis of denunciations from neighbors with personal grievances, from informants who were paid per name, from sources whose reliability was never systematically verified. The program produced paperwork. It produced monthly statistics. It produced reports that moved up the chain of command and were incorporated into the larger narrative of pacification progress. What it did not produce was an accurate record of who was killed, under what circumstances, and on what basis. The soldiers and intelligence officers who participated in Phoenix carried that knowledge with them when they came home. Some of them were transferred back to conventional units after their Phoenix assignments, and their personnel files reflected their conventional service without noting the special assignment. Some of them left the military entirely and found that their discharge papers described a service history that was accurate in its broad outlines, but missing the operational specifics that would have explained the particular weight they carried. They were not disappeared. They were simply partially documented up to the point where documentation would have created problems and no further. This partial documentation had consequences that extended beyond the administrative. It meant that the psychological injuries these men carried, and they carried significant psychological injuries, were injuries without official context. When the Veterans Administration began, slowly and grudgingly, in the late 1970s and 1980s, to acknowledge post-traumatic stress as a legitimate medical condition and not merely a weakness of character, it faced the problem that diagnosis required some account of what the soldier had experienced. And if what the soldier had experienced was not in his records, or if his records described a cleaner version of his experience than the one he was living with, the diagnostic process became complicated. Men were told that their claims were inconsistent with their service record. They were told that the events they described were not documented. They were told, in some cases explicitly and in others through bureaucratic implication, that if the institution had no record of something happening, then from the institution's perspective, it had not happened. The gap between institutional memory and individual memory is one of the defining features of the Vietnam War's aftermath, and it is a gap that was not accidental. It was produced by the same documentary practices that had distorted the record during the war itself, and it had the same function, to maintain a version of events that was more manageable than the true version. The true version, as the men who lived it understood it, was not a story with a clear moral, a definable enemy, a measurable objective, or a coherent outcome. It was a story of sustained confusion, of violence that was sometimes directed and sometimes random, of policies that were articulated with precision and executed with improvisation, of a system that consumed enormous resources and human lives in the pursuit of an objective that its own architects could never quite define. The definition problem ran through the entire war like a structural fault. What was the objective in Vietnam? In 1965, it was to prevent the fall of South Vietnam to communist forces. But preventing the fall required a South Vietnamese government capable of governing, and the South Vietnamese government was consistently incapable of governing in ways that would have produced the political loyalty necessary to sustain military resistance. The government in Saigon was, at various points, a military junta, a nominally civilian administration controlled by military figures, a series of coups and counter-coups that made long-term policy planning essentially meaningless, and a system of patronage and corruption that diverted American aid money at such a consistent rate that American advisors produced internal reports that were classified and did not circulate, estimating that a substantial fraction of all American economic assistance to South Vietnam was being stolen by the government officials responsible for distributing it. This information existed in the official record. It was known. It was documented in classified cables and internal assessments that made their way to Washington, where they were read by people who understood their implications and who continued to authorize the aid anyway. The gap between the classified record and the public record was not a gap between information and ignorance. It was a gap between information and policy, which is a different and more disturbing kind of gap. The classified record showed that the strategy was not working. The public record showed that the strategy was progressing. And the people who had access to both records continued to make public statements that reflected the public record rather than the classified one, for reasons that were partly political, partly institutional, and partly a form of organizational momentum that had taken on a life independent of any individual's intentions. The soldiers in the field did not have access to the classified record in any systematic way, but they did not need it. They had access to the ground truth, which was in many respects more complete than either the public or the classified version. They knew that the hamlets they had cleared last month were no longer secure. They knew that the popular forces units they were advising were not fighting effectively because many of their members had relatives in the Viet Cong, and loyalty to the government in Saigon was thin and sometimes entirely absent. They knew that the pacification metrics being reported by the Hamlet evaluation system were being inflated because the American advisors who compiled those metrics were under pressure to show improvement. and because the South Vietnamese officials who provided the underlying data had every incentive to report their areas as more secure than they were. The soldiers knew all of this from direct observation, and they reported it informally among themselves, and sometimes formally in reports that worked their way up the chain of command and then stopped moving. A report that made it to the brigade level, but not the division level. A report that made it to the division level, but was absorbed into a summary that softened its conclusions. A report that made it all the way to MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam in Saigon, and was noted and filed and did not change anything. The system was not designed to transmit bad news in ways that would produce policy change. It was designed to transmit information in ways that would support the narrative already being maintained for political purposes in Washington, which meant that bad news was consistently filtered, summarized, reframed, and reduced to footnotes in documents whose headlines told a different story. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, believed in the attrition strategy and believed that the body count numbers he was receiving were approximately accurate. His staff worked to ensure they were approximately favorable. The difference between approximately accurate and approximately favorable was a difference that his staff understood and that he, at some level, chose not to examine too closely. The command climate he created rewarded the production of favorable numbers, and command climates have a way of producing the information they reward, regardless of whether that information reflects reality. By 1967, there were officers at multiple levels of the command who understood that the numbers were unreliable, that the strategic situation was not improving at the rate being reported, and that the conditions for military success, as success had been defined, were not being created on the ground. These officers wrote reports. Some of those reports exist in the archives. They are not ambiguous documents. The most significant single internal document challenging the official optimism of the Westmoreland period was the Systems Analysis Office assessment that McNamara received in 1967, which concluded that after 2 years of sustained American military effort at an enormous scale, there was no evidence that the enemy's ability to fight was being degraded at a rate that would produce a favorable military outcome within any foreseeable timeline. This assessment was based on the same data that MACV was using to report progress, just analyzed differently, without the motivated reasoning that filtered the data at the command level. McNamara read it. He understood it. He had already privately concluded that the war was not winnable in the terms that had been publicly defined. He continued to publicly express support for the strategy. He continued to request additional troops. He continued to authorize additional bombing campaigns. He resigned at the end of 1967 to take the presidency of the World Bank, an exit that was framed as a promotion, and that was, in reality, a removal from a position he had come to believe was impossible. His successor as Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, commissioned his own review in early 1968, immediately after his confirmation, and the review produced the same conclusion. After 3 years of massive American military commitment, there was no clear path to the political and military objective that had been defined as victory, and the objective itself was so vague that there was no way to define what victory would actually look like. Clifford became the second consecutive Secretary of Defense to reach the private conclusion that the war could not be won in any meaningful sense. He also became, unlike McNamara, someone who acted on that conclusion in his official capacity, and the policy shift that led eventually to negotiations and withdrawal began in part from his recommendations in the spring of 1968. But the shift in policy did not produce an immediate shift in the conduct of the war. The war continued for 7 more years after Clifford's 1968 assessment. It continued through a negotiating process that was repeatedly interrupted by military escalations designed to improve the American bargaining position, a strategy that required more American soldiers to die for objectives that the policy level had already privately concluded were unachievable. The soldiers in the field during those 7 years were fighting in a context that their leadership understood to be essentially hopeless, without being told that their leadership understood this. The information asymmetry between soldiers and command during the final years of the war was not incidental. It was the condition that made continued military operations politically possible. You could not tell men that they were being asked to die in a war that their government had concluded was unwinnable without producing a complete collapse of military discipline and public political support. So, you did not tell them. You maintained the performance of strategic purpose, and the men fought within that performance, and some of them died within it, and some of them survived it and came home carrying the knowledge that something had been wrong at a level they could feel, but not fully articulate. The soldiers who came home with that knowledge but without the documents that would have explained it were not, in any organized sense, the victims of a deliberate cover-up. The cover-up, such as it was largely the cumulative effect of institutional practices rather than a coordinated conspiracy. Individual decisions, each of which made bureaucratic sense at the time, produced a collective outcome in which the full truth of what had happened in Vietnam was distributed across a vast number of classified documents, private memories, burned records, and the silence of men who had been trained not to speak about what they had done. Some of those men are still alive. Most are now in their 70s and 80s, and many of them have spent the intervening decades in a particular relationship with their own history, a relationship defined by the impossibility of reconciling the private knowledge of what they had done with the public account of the war that had, over time, been assembled from the materials that were available for assembly. They watched the war become a historical subject, watched books be written, documentaries be produced, memorials be built, and found that the history being assembled did not quite match the thing they remembered. Not because the history was wrong in its facts, but because the history was organized around facts that were available and documentable, and the things they knew were not available and documentable in the same way. There is a particular kind of silence that is not secrecy and not repression in any clinical sense, but is simply the recognition that certain kinds of truth have no available audience. The men who had been in Cambodia before the official incursion, who had crossed the border in small teams to gather intelligence or to conduct raids that were never officially acknowledged, could have spoken about what they had done. There was no specific law preventing them from doing so after the classification periods expired, though classification periods for some of those operations extended for decades. The reason many of them did not speak was more ordinary. Nobody was asking the right questions, and when they tried to explain the context of their experience, the context was so far outside the frame of reference of the people they were talking to that the explanation itself became exhausting. The frame of reference for Vietnam, as it developed in American public discourse from the late 1970s onward, was built primarily from the most visible and most documented aspects of the war. The major battles, Ia Drang, Hue, Khe Sanh, were documented in detail because they had been covered by journalists and produced official after-action reports at a scale that was difficult to suppress. The strategic bombing campaigns were documented in the statistics of sorties flown and tonnage dropped, which were released partly because they were the kind of metric that looked like accomplishment even when the strategic effect was questionable. The anti-war movement and its internal politics were extensively documented because the participants had every incentive to document themselves. The experience of the infantry soldier in the field, the long patrols through territory that nobody really controlled, the ambiguous engagements, the endemic corruption, the slow erosion of any coherent purpose, was documented less completely because it produced fewer official documents, and because the people who had lived it were not, for the most part, in the business of writing books. The soldiers who were most comprehensively undocumented were the ones operating in the most sensitive areas of the war. Special Forces soldiers conducting operations in denied areas. CIA case officers running networks of agents whose identities could never be officially acknowledged. Military intelligence personnel attached to units that existed only in internal documents that were never declassified. Psychological operations teams conducting programs that were officially described in terms that bore little relationship to their actual function. These soldiers existed in the official record at a level of abstraction that did not capture what they had done, and when they came home, they carried the unabstracted version in ways that their documentation could not support. The Veterans Administration, throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, was systematically unprepared for the complexity of the claims this population made. The institution was designed to process claims based on documented service-related injury, and it was facing a population whose most significant injuries were psychological rather than physical, and whose service records, for a substantial number of claimants, were incomplete in ways that were not explained in the records themselves. The result was a claims process that was, for many veterans, re-traumatizing in its insistence that documented reality was the only reality the institution could process. Men who had experienced things that left no official trace were told, in effect, that those experiences did not constitute a basis for a claim. This was not, in most cases, deliberate cruelty. The VA employees processing these claims were not hostile to veterans. They were operating within a system designed around documentation, and they had no tool for handling the absence of documentation. The system had been built on the assumption that the military kept reliable records, and that those records, when presented, would accurately reflect a soldier's service. The assumption was reasonable as applied to conventional military service. It was systematically false as applied to the portions of the Vietnam War that had been conducted in the shadows of official policy. The slow, grinding work of getting those records corrected or supplemented, where it happened at all, happened through a combination of congressional intervention, legal advocacy, and the gradual declassification of documents that confirmed what individual soldiers had claimed. In some cases, declassification came too late to benefit the men who had made the claims. They had died, or their claims had been denied, and they had exhausted their appeals, or they had simply stopped fighting a bureaucratic system that had made clear it would not accommodate their experience. The declassified documents sat in the National Archives, accessible to historians and researchers, confirming what the VA had denied years earlier, and the men those documents described were no longer in a position to benefit from the confirmation. The Phoenix program participants who came forward in later years, some of them in response to congressional hearings in the 1970s, others in response to journalists working on histories of the war, described a system that had operated largely outside the normal military accountability structure, and that had produced outcomes that nobody at the policy level wanted to examine too carefully. The program's official statistics showed neutralizations. The former participants described something more complicated, a system in which the distinction between intelligence-driven targeting and quota-driven killing had become progressively blurred as the program scaled up and as the pressure to produce results increased. They described villages in which the provincial reconnaissance units had conducted operations that resulted in the deaths of people whose connection to the Viet Cong infrastructure was, at best, presumed rather than established. They described intelligence reports that had been written after the fact to justify operations rather than to guide them. They described a chain of accountability that dissolved at the point where accountability would have required someone to acknowledge that the program was operating outside the boundaries of its official description. William Colby, who directed the Phoenix program before becoming CIA director, maintained throughout his life that the program was legitimate, that its casualties were combatants, and that it had significantly degraded the Viet Cong political infrastructure. He also acknowledged in congressional testimony in 1971 that he could not verify the accuracy of the neutralization statistics because the decentralized nature of the program meant that the Central Command had limited ability to audit the reports coming from provincial units. He acknowledged that abuses had occurred. He did not acknowledge the scale of those abuses because the scale was something the program's own documentation was not designed to capture. The Senate hearings in 1971, during which Colby testified, are worth examining because they illustrate how official accountability for the conduct of the war was simultaneously produced and circumscribed. The hearings were real. Testimony was taken, documents were submitted, and the official record of those hearings exists and can be read. But the hearings operated within limits that were partly formal Witnesses invoked security classification to decline to answer specific questions, and partly informal, the questions asked reflected the knowledge the questioners had, and the questioners did not always know what they did not know. The hearings produced a record that confirmed that abuses had occurred and that the program had generated casualties beyond what its official description would have predicted. But they did not produce a comprehensive accounting because the information necessary for a comprehensive accounting was distributed across classified files that the committee did not have full access to. This was the pattern throughout every official investigation into the conduct of the Vietnam War. Partial accountability, conducted in good faith by some of the participants, but structurally limited by the classification system, the incomplete documentation, and the institutional interest of the agencies being investigated in controlling the flow of information. The Church Committee in 1975 and 1976, which investigated CIA activities including those in Vietnam, produced more information than any previous official inquiry, but its members acknowledged in their own report that they had been unable to fully document the scope of some of the activities they were investigating because the relevant records either had been destroyed or were maintained in forms that limited committee access. Records were destroyed. This is a fact that tends to be acknowledged in footnotes when it should be acknowledged in headlines. The CIA conducted a systematic destruction of files in the early 1970s before the Church Committee, relating to programs it considered sensitive. This destruction was itself documented, because the people carrying it out wrote memos about what they were doing, as bureaucracies tend to do. But the memos documented the fact of destruction without documenting the content of what was destroyed. The military conducted similar reviews of sensitive operational records, though the term review was sometimes a euphemism for the kind of selective culling that removed the most operationally specific materials while preserving enough of the record to demonstrate that the review had been conducted. Former participants in those review processes have described, in interviews conducted by historians, the criteria used to determine what would be preserved and what would be destroyed. And those criteria were explicitly oriented around protecting individuals and institutions from accountability rather than preserving historical accuracy. The soldiers who came back without records existed, in part, because some of the records that would have documented their service had been destroyed before they came back, not to harm them specifically, but as a byproduct of institutional self-protection that did not take their future administrative needs into account. They were collateral damage of the archive. The operations they had participated in were too sensitive to document completely, so they had never been fully documented. When the partial documentation was subsequently destroyed as part of broader file reviews, the men associated with those operations were left with service records that were accurate as far as they went and uninformative beyond that point. When they presented those records to the VA or to congressional representatives or to journalists, the records confirmed that they had served and did not confirm what they had done while serving, which meant that the specific claims they were making about the nature of their service could not be verified through official channels. Some of those claims were eventually confirmed through other means. The declassification of State Department cables describing cross-border operations, the release of MACV records from the early 1970s, the gradual opening of CIA operational files that had survived the destruction reviews, these produced a body of documentation that substantiated, in general terms, many of the claims that veterans of special operations and intelligence activities had been making for years. But general substantiation is not individual documentation, and the claims process required individual documentation. A declassified cable confirming that American forces had conducted operations in a particular area of Laos in 1970 did not constitute documentation that a specific soldier had been part of those operations, and without individual documentation, the claims process remained blocked. The men who had been in Laos, who had participated in operations supporting the Hmong resistance against North Vietnamese forces infiltrating through the Plain of Jars, existed within a war that was, officially, not happening. The scale of the Laotian operation, which at its peak involved thousands of Hmong fighters, substantial CIA paramilitary support, American pilots flying combat missions out of bases that did not officially exist, and a logistical operation that consumed hundreds of millions of dollars in CIA funds, was roughly equivalent to a medium-sized conventional military campaign. It ran from the late 1950s through 1975. Its existence was classified for most of that period. The Americans who participated in it were, in many cases, military personnel who had been transferred to the CIA for the duration of their assignment, a bureaucratic mechanism that removed them from the normal military record-keeping system. When the operation ended, when Laos fell to the Pathet Lao in 1975, and the Hmong fighters who had served American interests were left to face the consequences, the Americans associated with the operation were returned to their previous institutional affiliations with records that documented the transfer without documenting what had happened during the intervening period. The fate of the Hmong themselves is a separate chapter in the history of the war's consequences. A chapter that is relevant here because it illustrates the completeness of the abandonment that occurred when operations ended. The Hmong soldiers who had fought for decades in support of American objectives, who had suffered casualties at a rate that was proportionally among the highest of any group in the entire conflict, who had been explicitly promised support and protection by CIA officers whose promises represented, in the perception of the Hmong leaders they were made to, the commitment of the United States government, were left behind when the American presence in Laos ended. The CIA officers who had made those promises did not have the authority to make them on behalf of the government. The government had no legal obligation that it acknowledged. The Hmong were not American soldiers. They were not party to any treaty, and their claim on American protection, which in human terms was overwhelming, was in bureaucratic terms essentially non-existent. Some Hmong made it to Thailand. Some eventually came to the United States as refugees. Many did not make it anywhere, caught in a Pathet Lao reprisal that continued for years after the war ended. The American officers who had worked with them, who knew what had been promised and what had not been delivered, carried that knowledge in the same general category as the other things they carried. The knowledge that the official account and the actual account were different documents, and that the official account was the only one that existed in any form that could be pointed to. The relationship between what happened and what was documented in Vietnam extended, in its implications, well beyond the specific individuals who were undocumented. It affected the historical record in ways that are still being worked through, and it affected the political culture in ways that are perhaps more consequential than the historical record. The war produced a population of survivors who knew from direct experience that official accounts of events could be systematically wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being fabricated from nothing, but wrong in the sense of being organized around the data that was politically useful while ignoring the data that was not. These survivors did not all respond to this knowledge in the same way. Some became political activists, using their credibility as veterans to challenge official accounts of subsequent military actions. Some retreated into silence, convinced that speaking would not be heard, and might only reactivate things they were trying not to carry. Some continued to work within the institutions they had served, applying their knowledge of institutional failure to the question of how to prevent future institutional failures with varying degrees of success. The veterans who testified at the Winter Soldier investigation in 1971, organized by Vietnam veterans against the war, were attempting to create an alternative official record, to put into documented form the account of the war that the official documentation had not captured. The testimony that was produced at those hearings was detailed, specific, and, in many of its particulars, subsequently confirmed by other evidence. It was also received at the time and for years afterward with a skepticism that was not entirely unjustified, because some of the testimony was exaggerated and some of the participants were providing accounts of events they had not directly witnessed, and because the political context of the hearings gave critics an easy basis for dismissal. The testimony that was accurate was discredited by association with the testimony that was not, and the opportunity to create a documented alternative record was largely lost to the political circumstances surrounding the project. The My Lai massacre, is the most documented example of the kind of conduct that the Winter Soldier testimony was attempting to place in a broader context. My Lie happened in March 1968. It was investigated internally by the Army, and the investigation was suppressed at the division level, meaning that the people responsible for documenting it were also the people responsible for covering it up, and they chose coverage over documentation. It became public knowledge in November 1969, more than a year and a half later, through the investigative work of journalist Seymour Hersh, who had received a tip from a source outside the official chain. The official investigation that followed, the Peers Commission, documented the massacre in considerable detail and documented the cover-up in even more detail. The Peers report established that the cover-up had involved officers at multiple levels of the chain of command, that evidence had been destroyed, that witnesses had been discouraged from making formal complaints, and that the reporting system had functioned as it was designed to function in producing a result where nothing was officially known. The prosecutions that followed My Lie are the part of the story that most clearly illustrates how accountability and documentation can be selectively deployed. Charges were filed against more than 24 officers and enlisted men. The vast majority of charges were dropped before trial. One person, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted of murdering 22 civilians. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 3 days in prison before being transferred to house arrest by order of President Nixon, who was responding to a political climate in which a significant portion of the American public viewed Calley as a scapegoat rather than a criminal. Calley was ultimately pardoned after serving approximately 3 years of house arrest. The officers who had covered up the massacre served no prison time. The officers who had created the command climate in which the massacre occurred were not charged. The systemic conditions that had produced My Lie were examined in the Peers report, filed, and largely not acted upon in any structural sense. The message that this outcome sent to the soldiers who were still fighting the war was not a message that anyone intended to send, but it was a message that was received. It confirmed what many soldiers already suspected, that the formal accountability system was available for deployment when it was politically convenient and not available when it was not, and that the institutional interest in protecting its own reputation would consistently take priority over the institutional interest in accurate documentation. This was not paranoia. It was an inference from observed facts that happened to be correct. The soldiers who adapted most successfully to the Vietnam environment, successful in the narrow sense of surviving their tours with their functional capacity intact, were the ones who made an early and realistic adjustment to the conditions they actually faced rather than the conditions they had been told to expect. They adjusted to the fact that the strategic situation was more ambiguous than their training had described. They adjusted to the fact that the distinction between combatant and civilian was contested in ways their rules of engagement had not fully prepared them for. They adjusted to the fact that the command structure was transmitting expectations that bore an uncertain relationship to the tactical reality on the ground. They adjusted most of all to the pervasive uncertainty of fighting an enemy who controlled the timing and character of most engagements, who could dissolve into the civilian population with complete effectiveness, and whose political support in the areas where the war was being fought was, in many cases, more durable than the American-backed governments. This adjustment required a kind of cognitive flexibility that was also a kind of moral flexibility, and the line between the two was not always easy to locate. A unit that adjusted to the ambiguity of who was a combatant by developing informal rules of engagement that were more permissive than the official rules was adapting to its environment in a way that had practical military logic, and that also produced, in some cases, the killing of people who should not have been killed. The soldiers in that unit understood this. They did not necessarily understand it in those terms at the time, but they understood that they were operating in a space where the normal categories had become unreliable, and where the consequences of that unreliability were being distributed in ways that the official record would not capture. The term free fire zone, which entered the vocabulary of the war in the mid-1960s and was later officially replaced with the less suggestive term specified strike zone, described areas in which anyone present could be presumed to be an enemy combatant, and in which rules of engagement were accordingly relaxed to permit fire without prior warning or positive identification. The logic of the free fire zone was that its existence would have been announced to civilians, giving them the opportunity to leave, and that anyone remaining was therefore either a combatant or someone supporting combatants. The practical reality of free fire zones was that the announcements were not always made, or were not made in ways that reached the people in the affected areas, or were understood by the affected people to mean something different from what the military intended. And the practical reality was also that even when the announcements were made and understood, not everyone could leave. Elderly people who could not travel, people who refused to abandon their land, people who had nowhere to go, people who had been told by the local Viet Cong, on pain of death, that they should not leave. In a free fire zone, these people were, according to the operational logic, potential targets. The reports generated by operations in free fire zones classified the dead in categories that reflected the operational logic rather than the empirical reality of who those people had been. The soldiers who conducted those operations lived with both the operational logic and the empirical reality, and the distance between them was a distance that official documentation was designed to prevent from being visible. The psychological literature on Vietnam veterans, which began to accumulate seriously in the late 1970s and expanded dramatically through the 1980s as post-traumatic stress disorder, achieved formal diagnostic recognition, consistently identified as a major factor in veterans' psychological difficulties, not the violence they had experienced and committed, though that was certainly present, but the moral injury that accompanied operating in conditions of systematic ambiguity without adequate institutional support for processing that ambiguity. The concept of moral injury, which was not formally articulated in the literature until the work of Jonathan Shea and others in the late 1980s and 1990s, described the damage done to an individual's sense of moral order by participating in or witnessing actions that violated that individual's core moral beliefs, particularly when those actions were authorized or encouraged by authority figures who were supposed to embody institutional values. The Vietnam War was, in the experience of many of its participants, a sustained condition of moral injury, not because every engagement was atrocious, but because the institutional framework within which every engagement occurred was operating in a mode of systematic misrepresentation that made it impossible for individual soldiers to locate their actions within a reliable moral context. When the institution tells you that what you are doing is serving a clear objective, and you can observe that the objective is not being achieved, and the institution continues to tell you that it is being achieved, you are not simply confused about tactics. You are being placed in a position where your ability to make moral sense of your own actions is systematically undermined by the information environment you are operating in. This is the environment that the soldiers who came back without records had inhabited for the duration of their service. The absence of records was not the primary damage. It was the symptom. The primary damage was the experience of operating in a system that was designed at every level to produce a version of the war that was different from the war being experienced, and that treated the gap between the two versions as a management problem rather than a moral problem. The men who came back without records were the ones for whom that gap was largest, because their service had occurred in the areas where the two versions were most divergent, and because the institutional interest in managing the gap was most acute. The declassification of documents from the Vietnam era has been a slow and uneven process that continues to this day. The most sensitive operational files of the CIA, including those relating to the secret war in Laos and the conduct of the Phoenix program, have been released in installments over several decades, with significant redactions that in some cases make it impossible to reconstruct a complete operational picture. The military records from the same period are more comprehensively available because the military's classification criteria were somewhat more standardized and because congressional pressure in the 1970s and 1980s pushed the services to release records that were relevant to veterans' claims. But military records and CIA records together do not constitute a complete picture because significant portions of the war were conducted through mechanisms that fell outside normal record-keeping, including the use of civilian contractors for military functions, the use of third-country nationals whose activities were never formally documented in American records, and the use of informal coordination mechanisms between agencies that produced no paper trail. The operational record of the Studies and Observation Group, the Special Operations Unit that conducted highly classified cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, is still not fully available. The group's missions, which involved small teams of American Special Forces soldiers and indigenous fighters conducting reconnaissance, raids, and operations in denied areas, are documented in a mix of classified operational reports, some of which have been released in redacted form, and in the memories of the approximately 2,000 American soldiers who served in the unit. The soldiers who served in SOG carried clearances that prevented them from discussing their operations, in some cases for decades after the operations had been conducted. Some of them are still living and still legally constrained in what they can say publicly, though the classification of most SOG operations has now technically expired. The institutional habit of silence does not expire with the legal constraint. The soldiers who served in SOG and who had difficulty accessing veterans' benefits were not, in the early years after the war, able to explain the nature of their service in terms that the VA could process. Their records showed Special Forces assignment. They did not show the operational specifics that would have explained the nature of the injuries they were claiming. Men who had been on missions that went catastrophically wrong, who had lost teammates in operations that never officially happened, who had been captured and released or captured and escaped, or had simply come back from missions that left them with no framework for what they had experienced, presented themselves to the VA with records that documented the broad contours of their service and nothing more. The Pao Maye issue, the question of American prisoners of war and soldiers missing in action in Vietnam, is the most politically charged aspect of the documentation problem, and it is worth addressing because it illustrates how the absence of documentation can be weaponized in both directions. There are families who believe, based on accounts that have never been fully verified, that American soldiers remained alive in Vietnamese custody after the war ended, held as bargaining chips by a government that found them useful. The government's position has consistently been that all Americans known to be alive in captivity were returned in Operation Homecoming in 1973, and that subsequent reports of live Americans were not verifiable. Neither position is entirely satisfying, and the reason neither position is entirely satisfying is that the documentation of American prisoners and missing in action during the war was itself incomplete, because some of the operations in which Americans were lost were operations that could not be officially acknowledged, and therefore the loss of the individuals involved could not be officially documented in ways that would have supported a subsequent search. There are specific cases where American soldiers were listed as missing in action rather than killed in action, or listed under circumstances that did not reflect the actual conditions of their disappearance, because the actual conditions would have required acknowledging operations that were officially denied. The families of those soldiers were given accounts that were inaccurate. The inaccuracy was not intended to harm the families. It was intended to protect the operational security of programs that were ongoing at the time the soldiers were lost, and the protection of those programs was considered more important than the accuracy of the information provided to the families. This is a judgment that was made by people with authority to make it, and it produced consequences for families that lasted decades. The intersection of the documentation problem with the Pao Maye issue created a space where legitimate concern for the fate of missing Americans became entangled with political agendas that were not always oriented toward the truth. Legitimate researchers and advocates who were trying to account for soldiers whose records were incomplete were operating alongside individuals who were using the Pau Maye issue for political purposes, and the two groups were difficult to distinguish from outside, which gave the government a convenient basis for dismissing legitimate concerns by associating them with the less credible elements of the Pau Maye advocacy community. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of Vietnam-related documentation controversies, legitimate claims being dismissed by association with illegitimate ones, and the government using that association as a tool for avoiding accountability. The soldiers who came back years later, who came back without records matching what they had done, who came back into a country that had decided to conduct a particular kind of reckoning with the war, one that was more manageable than a full accounting, found that the space for their particular truth was limited. The anti-war veterans who testified about atrocities were accommodated within the anti-war narrative. The conservative veterans who maintained that the war had been fought honorably and lost through political failure were accommodated within a different narrative. The soldiers whose experience fit neither narrative cleanly, who understood the war as neither the atrocity the anti-war movement described nor the honorable mission the conservative narrative described, but as something more disorienting than either, something that had been disorganized at its roots and had unraveled in ways that did not map onto either available moral framework, had fewer places to put what they knew. The Veterans Administration's evolution in its treatment of Vietnam veterans is a history that runs parallel to and is partly explained by the history of the war's documentation. In the early years after the war, the VA was still operating primarily in a framework designed for World War II and Korean War veterans, a framework that assumed a relatively clear connection between documented service and documented injury, and that was not well designed to handle the particular character of Vietnam-related injury. The high rate of mental health claims, the ambiguity of many physical claims related to Agent Orange exposure, the documentation problems associated with special operations and intelligence service, all of these created strains on a system that was not designed for them. The institutional response initially was to deny claims that the system could not process, not because the people running the system were hostile to veterans, but because they had no other tool. Denial was the default when documentation was inadequate, and documentation was frequently inadequate. Agent Orange is worth dwelling on as a separate but related example of how institutional documentation practices shaped the experience of veterans trying to access benefits. The herbicide mixture used extensively throughout the war to deforest areas and destroy crops that might support enemy forces was, by the time veterans were beginning to report health effects in the late 1970s, the subject of scientific controversy about its long-term health effects. Controversy that was complicated by the fact that the chemical companies that manufactured it had conducted internal research suggesting health risks that they had not made public. The VA's initial position on Agent Orange claims was that there was insufficient scientific evidence to establish a connection between exposure and the health conditions veterans were claiming. This position was not entirely unreasonable given the state of the science at the time, but it was maintained in ways that reflected institutional interest in limiting claim costs rather than a neutral assessment of the evidence, and it was maintained long after the evidence had accumulated to a point where the connection was, in any fair assessment, established. Veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange, and the exposure had been widespread because the herbicide was applied in enormous quantities over a large portion of the country, were presenting with health conditions that their physicians associated with chemical exposure, and that the VA was declining to connect to their service because the official position was that exposure had not occurred at a level that would produce the claimed effects. This was, in its structure, the same problem as the documentation problem. The official record describing one reality and the individual experience describing another, with the institution requiring the official record as the basis for any claim. The Agent Orange claims took decades to resolve, and the resolution came through legislative action rather than administrative reform, through the Agent Orange Act of 1991 and subsequent additions to the list of covered conditions, forcing the VA to accept presumptive service connection for certain conditions rather than requiring individual veterans to prove exposure and causation. The men whose service in Vietnam had been least documented, the special operations soldiers, the intelligence personnel, the participants in denied operations, faced a variant of the Agent Orange problem in their psychological health claims. They were claiming service connection for conditions that their records did not support, because their records did not describe the service that had caused the conditions. The legislative solution that worked for Agent Orange, establishing a presumptive connection based on service in a specific location during a specific time period, was more difficult to apply to psychological conditions because the connection between psychological injury and specific operational experience is more complex than the connection between chemical exposure and specific disease, and because the operational specifics that would have established the nature of the experience were themselves classified. The slow, grinding progress toward recognizing and compensating the full range of Vietnam-related injury, physical and psychological, is a progress that continues into the present and that still has not reached the men whose service was most deeply in the shadows. The Veterans Benefits Improvement Act, the various expansions of PTSD-related claims processing, the establishment of the Veterans Court of Appeals, each of these represented progress, but progress measured against a baseline of systematic inadequacy that had been built into the claim system from the beginning. The men who navigated that system and eventually received recognition for their service were the ones who had, through persistence, advocacy, and the accumulated weight of declassified documentation, managed to close the gap between what they had done and what the institution acknowledged they had done. Many others did not close that gap. The political history of the war's aftermath is, in significant part, a history of how different constituencies managed their relationship with the gap. The Reagan administration's embrace of the Vietnam veteran, the shift in the public cultural treatment of Vietnam veterans from stigmatized to honored, from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s, was a genuine improvement in the social standing of veterans that also served a political function. The rehabilitation of the Vietnam veterans' image occurred alongside a rehabilitation of the Vietnam War itself, a reframing of the war as a noble cause poorly executed rather than a mistaken enterprise, and the rehabilitation of the veterans was partly a way of rehabilitating the decision to fight. Honoring the soldiers made it easier to argue that the war itself had been honorable, and arguing that the war had been honorable made it easier to argue that future military commitments of a similar character would be legitimate. The soldiers who had survived the war with the knowledge that it had not been honorable in many of its specifics found this political rehabilitation uncomfortable. They were being honored for service that they understood to have been conducted in a context of systematic institutional failure, and the honoring was accompanied by an implicit requirement that they not speak in too much detail about the specific character of the failure. You could honor veterans while maintaining the general story that the war had been a noble effort, or you could honor veterans while acknowledging the specific institutional failures that had characterized the conduct of the war. But doing both simultaneously was politically difficult, and the path of least political resistance was the former. The Wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, is the most successful resolution of this tension that American culture has produced. By memorializing individuals rather than the war, by listing names without comment on the circumstances of the deaths those names represented, the memorial created a space that could be experienced by veterans with very different relationships to the war without requiring any of them to accept an official interpretation they rejected. The memorial is the one major Vietnam-era monument that has not been a source of significant controversy among veterans, precisely because it declines to tell them what their service meant. It only tells them that they were there, that they are remembered, and that the loss is acknowledged. It does not tell them whether the war was right, whether it was won, whether it was conducted honorably, or whether the decisions made by those above them in the chain of command were wise or foolish. It is a monument to absence, and it works as a monument to absence because absence is the thing that most of the survivors understand best about the war. The men who came back without records knew a particular form of absence. They knew the absence of institutional acknowledgment for the most significant experiences of their lives. They knew the absence of the documentation that would have allowed them to claim the benefits their service entitled them to. They knew the absence of any public narrative in which their specific experience was accurately represented. And many of them knew, as they aged into the decades after the war, the absence of any expectation that these absences would be remedied in their lifetimes. The declassification process has moved forward, unevenly and incompletely, and continues to move forward. Documents that were classified at the highest levels in the 1970s are now accessible to historians and researchers who can use them to reconstruct aspects of the war that were invisible in the public record. The academic literature on the Vietnam War has grown enormously and has become significantly more accurate in its assessment of the operational reality of the war than the early accounts that were based on the available public record. Books based on extensive archival research have confirmed in documented detail many of the claims that veterans of special operations and intelligence activities had been making for years without documentation. The gap between the official record and the experiential record has narrowed in historical terms, even as it has remained unclosed for many of the individuals who lived inside it. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which was one of the central pacification strategies of the early 1960s, and which was presented to the American public and to Congress as a significant success in the process of winning the support of the South Vietnamese rural population, is now understood, on the basis of documentation that was not available at the time, to have been a significant failure that produced results opposite to its stated objectives. The program, which forcibly relocated Vietnamese rural communities into fortified settlements designed to separate them from Viet Cong influence, destroyed the social fabric of communities that had been rooted in specific land for generations, created profound resentment toward the government that was displacing them, and generated conditions in which Viet Cong recruitment was significantly easier rather than harder. The people who designed the program knew, from the data their own reporting systems were generating, that it was not achieving its objectives. The people who reported the program to Congress and the public reported it as a success. The gap between the two was, in its structure, identical to the gaps that appeared throughout the war's subsequent history. The soldiers who enforced the Strategic Hamlet Program, who participated in the forced relocations, who watched villages burned that their inhabitants might be moved to settlements they did not want to live in, understood from direct observation that the program was not achieving what they were told it was achieving. Some of them reported this understanding through official channels. Some of those reports worked their way up the chain of command and were incorporated into internal assessments that acknowledged the program's failures. Those assessments did not alter the public reporting. They became classified documents that confirmed what the official public account denied. And they sat in the archives until researchers began working through them decades later. The pattern is so consistent across the entire history of the war that it becomes difficult to attribute it to individual dishonesty in any meaningful sense. The individual decisions that produced the pattern, the decision to report a hamlet as secure when it was not, the decision to classify a casualty as a combatant when the evidence was ambiguous, the decision to file a report that described the operation more favorably than the reality warranted, were each made in a context where the institutional incentives made the distorted version easier than the accurate one, and where the consequences of accuracy seemed more immediate and more damaging than the consequences of distortion. The accumulation of individually defensible decisions produced a collectively indefensible outcome, a war conducted on the basis of systematically false information about its own progress by an institution that had created the conditions for that falsification through its own performance management systems. The soldiers who returned without records were the extreme end of a continuum that included every soldier who had ever written a report that simplified the reality it was describing, every officer who had ever transmitted a summary that reflected what his command wanted to hear rather than what he had observed, every intelligence analyst who had ever shaped an assessment to fit a policy conclusion that was already established. They were extreme because the gap between their records and their experience was total rather than partial. and because the institutional interest in maintaining that gap was stronger in their cases than in most. But they were not, in the logic of the institution, fundamentally different from anyone else who had operated within a system that rewarded favorable reporting and penalized unfavorable reporting, regardless of which one was more accurate. The men who understand this about the institution, who have the particular kind of knowledge that comes from having been inside a system at the level where its internal logic is most visible, carry a certain weight that is not easily communicated. It is not the weight of having done terrible things, though some of them carry that too. It is the weight of having understood a system from the inside, and having been unable, upon returning to civilian life, to transmit that understanding in any form that the people around them could receive. The world outside the institution had a version of what the war had been, and that version was connected to the reality of the war by a relationship that was partial, selective, and organized around what was politically and emotionally manageable rather than what was true. The men who knew more than the version sat in rooms with people who knew only the version, and they found that the knowledge they carried did not fit into the available containers. Some of them found each other. Veterans groups of various kinds created spaces where the unmanaged knowledge could circulate without requiring translation into the available containers. Special operations veterans who found that their specific experience was invisible in the general Vietnam narrative created networks through which operational knowledge that was still classified could circulate in the cautious, oblique way that people who have security clearances talk about things they are not supposed to talk about, using enough specificity to be understood by people with similar experience and enough vagueness to be deniable in any formal sense. These networks were not conspiracies. They were communities of people who shared a knowledge that had nowhere else to go. The oral history of the Vietnam War, the accounts that were gathered by researchers who went directly to the veterans rather than to the archives, is substantially richer and more complex than the documentary record, because the veterans carried information that the documents did not. The oral record also contains its own distortions. Memories that have been shaped by subsequent experience, accounts that have grown more dramatic with retelling, narratives that have been unconsciously organized around subsequent cultural representations of the war. But as a supplement to the documentary record, it is essential. It is the closest thing to a complete account of the war that exists, and it is not organized, not easily accessible, and not compatible with the kind of documentary citation that official history requires. The researchers who have worked to combine the oral record with the documentary record, who have spent decades cross-referencing veterans' accounts with declassified documents, who have produced work that is considerably more accurate than the early histories of the war, have also produced work that circulates primarily in academic contexts, and that has not significantly altered the public understanding of the war. The public understanding remains organized around the familiar landmarks: the Gulf of Tonkin, the Tet Offensive, My Lai, the fall of Saigon, the anti-war movement, the returning veteran. Each of these landmarks is understood in ways that are more accurate than they were in the immediate aftermath of the war, but the understanding remains organized around events that were documented at the time, and the vast, undocumented interior of the war remains largely invisible to the public. The interior of the war is where the men without records lived, the patrols that produced no engagement reports because there was nothing to report, the months of boredom broken by sudden violence that left no documentation because the violence was too small to warrant a formal report and too disturbing to put into the informal record, the relationships with South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians that were conducted in a linguistic and cultural framework that American institutional documentation was not designed to capture, the slow erosion of any clear sense of why the patrol was happening and what it was supposed to accomplish, the grinding repetition of operations that produced tactical results that disappeared within weeks because the strategic context in which those results occurred was not capable of consolidating them. This is the texture of the war that the documents do not convey, because the documents were not designed to convey texture. They were designed to convey numbers. A man who spent a year in the Mekong Delta in 1968, who went on 3 or 4 patrols a week, who lost 7 members of his platoon over 12 months, who watched the same villages be secured and lost and secured again in a cycle that seemed to have no trajectory toward any definable end, who came home and found that the official record of that year consisted of his service dates, his unit designation, his military occupational specialty, and a list of awards that described the military language of valor without describing what the valor had been for, that man carries a year of experience that his documentation does not contain. He is not without records in the most extreme sense, the sense of the special operations soldier whose entire deployment is unacknowledged. But he is without records in the more ordinary sense that his records do not capture the thing that happened to him, which is the year he spent in a war that did not know what it was trying to accomplish and did not stop trying anyway. That ordinary absence of documentation is perhaps more significant than the extraordinary absence, because it affected more people. The majority of Vietnam veterans did not serve in covert operations. The majority served in units that were fully documented, produced after-action reports, generated personnel records, and came home with service histories that were, in their broad outlines, complete. And yet, the majority of Vietnam veterans report, when asked about their experience and about how that experience relates to the official history of the war, a sense that the record does not match the reality. The record they left says they were there. It does not say what being there was like, what it meant, or what it did to them. The record is accurate and insufficient, and the insufficiency is not an accident. It is a design feature of a documentation system that was built to capture performance metrics and not to capture experience. The war in Vietnam was, from the perspective of the documentation system, a series of quantifiable events. Engagements, casualties, sorties, pacification scores, hamlet evaluations, refugee counts, tonnage of supplies destroyed, kilometers of trail interdicted, body counts. From the perspective of the people who lived through it, it was something that did not resolve into those categories. It was years of carrying ambiguity through terrain that did not yield, engaging with an enemy who understood the territory in ways that a conscripted army rotating through 12-month tours could never match, operating under rules of engagement that were simultaneously too restrictive in some situations and too permissive in others, receiving orders from a chain of command that was simultaneously generating optimistic reports to its superiors and issuing instructions that implicitly acknowledged those reports were not accurate. It was a war that consumed more than 58,000 American lives and 2 million or more Vietnamese lives in the pursuit of an objective that was never clearly defined, never achieved in any sustainable sense, and that the people directing the effort privately concluded was unachievable years before the effort ended. The war ended in April 1975, when North Vietnamese forces completed the conquest of South Vietnam, and the last American personnel were evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the embassy in Saigon, in images that were broadcast live and that entered the permanent visual record of the 20th century. It ended for the Americans who left on those helicopters and on the ships and planes that had been evacuating personnel for weeks. It did not end for the Vietnamese who faced years of re-education camps, political persecution, and an economy devastated by decades of war and by the American trade embargo that continued for 2 decades after the fall of Saigon. It did not end for the Hmong who faced years of guerrilla resistance and persecution in Laos. It did not end for the Cambodians who faced the specific horror of the Khmer Rouge, an outcome that was partly a consequence of the destabilization produced by years of American bombing and covert operations. It did not end, in any clean sense, for the Americans who had fought in it, who came home to a country that wanted to put the war behind it, with a speed that was not compatible with any realistic processing of what the war had been. The speed with which the war was officially concluded and officially set aside created the conditions in which the documentation problems festered. The records that should have been reviewed and corrected were not reviewed and corrected because the institutional priority was to close the file on Vietnam, not to audit it. The veterans who should have had their claims processed on the basis of accurate records were instead processed on the basis of the incomplete records that existed, because opening the question of record accuracy would have opened the question of what the accurate records would have shown, and that was a question nobody in a position of institutional authority wanted to answer in 1975 or 1976, or for several years thereafter. By the time the question was asked with any seriousness, the men who could have answered it most completely were scattered, some of them dead, some of them in conditions produced in part by the failure to address their claims at the time those claims should have been addressed. The institutional memory of the specific operational details that would have filled the gaps in the individual records had dispersed into the private memories of men who had no institutional role and no institutional platform. The records that existed in the archives were the records that had survived the review processes of the early 1970s, which meant they were the records that the reviewing institutions had decided to preserve, which meant they were the records most consistent with the version of the war that those institutions preferred to maintain. The version of the war that exists in the archives is not wrong. It is incomplete in ways that reflect the institutional choices made about what to document, what to preserve, and what to destroy. And the version of the war that exists in the memories of the men who fought it is not wrong either. It is incomplete in ways that reflect the limits of individual perception, the distortions of memory over time, and the particular angle of view that each individual's position in the war afforded. The truth of the war, if there is a single truth, exists somewhere in the gap between the two versions, in the space where institutional documentation and individual memory overlap without being identical, where each version illuminates something the other version cannot see. The soldiers who came back years later, the ones who came back without records matching what they had done, who showed up at VA offices and congressional offices and journalist offices with accounts that the available documentation could not support, were trying to close that gap from one side. They were trying to bring the official record into alignment with the experiential record, and they were doing so against institutional resistance that was partly legal, partly bureaucratic, and partly the simple inertia of a version that had been maintained for long enough that challenging it required more effort than most individuals could sustain. Some of them succeeded in the sense that the specific claims they were making were eventually confirmed and their benefits were eventually awarded. Some of them succeeded in the sense that the declassified documents that came out over the years confirmed the general truth of what they had described, even if the individual documentation was never fully corrected. Some of them simply stopped, not because they had given up on the truth of what they knew, but because continuing to fight for institutional acknowledgment of that truth was consuming the remaining years of their lives in a way that was not sustainable. They made a calculation that the energy required to close the gap was greater than the benefit of closing it, and they redirected that energy toward the practical business of living. They kept their records, such as they were. They kept the photographs that no official documentation would ever reference. The letters they had written home that described the world they were in with a directness that the after-action reports would never have permitted. The unofficial mementos of operations that had not officially occurred. They kept, in some cases, handwritten journals that had been written in violation of regulations against keeping personal records in combat zones. Journals that described what was happening in language that was too honest for any official document. They kept these things in boxes, in closets, and in drawers they did not often open. Some of them eventually gave these materials to archives, to universities, to the Library of Congress, to the collections that were being assembled by researchers trying to reconstruct a more complete account of the war. Some of them held on to these materials until they died, and then the materials were sorted by families who often did not know what they were looking at, and some of it was preserved, and some of it was lost. The war is receding now. The men who fought it are old. The historical record that will remain when those men are gone will be the composite of what was officially documented, what was declassified, what was gathered by oral historians, and what was preserved in private collections. It will be a richer record than the one that existed in 1975, significantly richer, imperfect in ways that reflect the specific character of the war's documentation, incomplete in ways that can never be fully remedied because some of the information that would complete it was destroyed, was never written down, or exists only in the memories of men who are no longer able to provide it. The soldier who came back without records, who is the figure at the center of this account, and who stands in for the many thousands who shared that condition in various degrees, represents something that the institution he served could never fully accommodate, the truth of a specific experience in a war that was defined, at every level of its conduct, by the systematic management of truth. He could prove he had served. He could not prove what the service had been, because the service had occurred in the space where the official record and the actual record diverged, and the institution that maintained both records had a vested interest in the divergence remaining invisible. The war officially ended. The troops came home. Those who came home at all. The documents were filed. Those that were filed at all. The reports were written. Those that were written at all. The numbers were tallied. The body counts were added up. The strategic assessments were compiled. The lessons were learned or noted or classified or destroyed. The soldiers who had been there when the tallying was done understood that what was being counted was not what had happened, and they carried that understanding home with them into the rest of their lives, where it settled into the specific silence of men who know that what they know has no available home in the story being told about what they were part of. And the story continued to be told, and the war continued to be documented, and the documents continued to describe a war that was, in important respects, not the war that had been fought.